Now let's kick off first of all, I suppose, with the latest news on the big tech censorship. Because I have to say, despite my obvious normal modesty, even us being knocked off YouTube has probably been usurped by the President of the United States being banned from Facebook and Twitter.
Well, what you've got here, I mean, and the piece I tweeted and that you've retweeted from Standpoint, I actually covered the issue as it was in mid 2019 in Standpoint. So the piece is slightly dated, although the law is reasonably accurately stated. Basically, in law, for a range of reasons in the United States, the European Union and the UK and elsewhere globally, but at this point these are the countries that matter, although the French are starting to get quite grumpy about this as well. So I suspect sovereign states within the EU are now going to have their words about this. The social media are treated differently from talk radio, the BBC, ITV, but also differently from the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, and so on and so forth. They are viewed as, and this is actually a legally inaccurate term, people will use the expression platform, but it doesn't actually mean that. They are viewed as places that host user-created content. Now, for a range of historical reasons, including litigation going back to the early days of the internet in the 1990s, they were originally granted complete immunity from suit as corporations for the behavior of their users. Now, that has progressively been chipped away in the United States and in the EU and in the UK, but for different reasons. In the US, it was over copyright initially, and then over allegations that they were facilitating sex trafficking and modern slavery, basically. And so, therefore, statutory carve-outs were made in the legislation that protects them. And the legislation in the United States is Section 230, and please don't laugh at the name of this, of the Communications Decency Act.
Sorry, couldn't help
yes,
it.
only the Americans could call it that. And then in the European Union, Article 13 of the European Copyright Directive gradually began to make social media companies liable for intellectual property breaches undertaken by their users. So what you've got is this very muddy situation where they're neither flesh nor fowl nor good red herring. You can't tell whether they're a publisher or a broadcaster like Talk Radio or the Times, or a platform, to use the shorthand, that just hosts user-generated content. It is completely unclear.
Yeah, because I mean, it would seem to me and to many people now that clearly what has become social media was not what it originally was. When the internet kind of first broke into the world of most people's homes, it was nothing like the way it is now. I mean, I remember having my first dial-up modem when I worked for the Daily Mirror, attached to a MacBook Pro, and I think it took me about 4 hours to actually manage to see something that they were trying to send me high res from the office on my computer because it was that slow. And you know, now it bears no resemblance to that. And it's not any longer simply a vehicle for other people's content, is it?
Well, no. This is the issue, and I mean, traditionally, when you're trying to work out liability, and of course, the big thing that the social media companies particularly want to avoid, even in the United States, but particularly in the United Kingdom, the European Union, and Australia, New Zealand, and the rest of the Commonwealth, countries like India and South Africa as well, what they particularly wish to avoid liability for, but for which you would be liable, is defamation, libel and slander. Okay, so that's the particular area where they're protected from suit. And as you would well know from your long experience as a journalist, that can get very, very expensive, that kind of liability. And it does mean that the social media companies enjoy a competitive advantage over other broadcasters and other publishers throughout the world, simply because they don't have to legal their users' content. Now, however, there has been a movement in the United States, but recently over here as well. And in some respects, it's quite misguided, but in one respect, it is telling the truth. The misguided aspect is they think that if you treat YouTube or Twitter or Facebook as publishers, like the Times or the BBC, there will be more free speech for conservatives.
Right.
This is simply untrue. Because if you do that, if you change their status in law, what will happen is that they will have to hire armies of lawyers and armies of editorial staff, exactly like a newspaper or the BBC or talk radio.
Yeah. But interestingly enough, I mean, because of all of the things that have happened with us and YouTube this week, I mean, we've all had conversations about how YouTube actually operates, and it's difficult to find out how they operate, but the belief is that they have a series of kind of algorithms. They have a series of fact checkers, I suppose, for want of a better phrase, who sit somewhere in the world, I'm not sure where, who get triggered by certain words or certain phrases or certain sort of pieces of information, and suddenly flags get put up, and nobody's really quite sure how that system works.
Well, this is a point, and I've made this in a shorter in addition to the Standpoint piece, which is a couple of years old now.
Yeah.
In a shorter piece for a new media startup called Lotus Eaters, where I make the point that Ofcom is transparent. You may not like it, but you know how it works, and it's accountable to Parliament.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's accountable to us. Whereas the problem with YouTube is nobody actually knows what is going on. I mean, I don't wish to sort of ventilate things that are still being dealt with by Talk Radio's in-house counsel, obviously, but you've probably not, and please don't answer this if it's going to cause difficulties. Have you even been told by YouTube what was going on?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
We've seen transparent response.
No, we've seen a statement from them, which we published, in which they said that we had somehow breached their community guidelines. Didn't really explain how or why, but the video, which was the apparently offending video, was left up after they decided that it suddenly didn't breach the community guidelines. So it's all a bit woolly, really.
Yes. So you've got this situation, and I have to say, I mean, because my background is not media law, although I have done some intellectual property stuff in the past, and because I'm a writer, I'm reasonably aware of that because I've had to sign contracts with publishers, that kind of thing, and contracts with TV shows and so on and so forth if they're going to pay you for an appearance. And I did talk to some media law friends, and I was quite shocked when 3 of them from separate firms and from separate jurisdictions made the point that the United States is so insular. And I mean, it doesn't matter what politics are, whether they're left wing, right wing, up wing, down wing, who cares? But Americans are so insular and know so little about other countries that it's entirely possible that the higher ups at YouTube in Silicon Valley didn't actually know that Ofcom exists.
No, that's entirely possible.
Which I found quite extraordinary. But I mean, I'm saying it because people who know a lot more about this area of the law than I do suggested it to me.
Oh, certainly. I mean, there were situations I seem to remember 2 or 3 years ago where there was an awful lot of hate being posted on Twitter around a certain footballer, and some of it was coming from the US. And in the US, obviously, freedom of speech is slightly differently treated, or at least it used to be before Twitter came along and banned the president. You could more or less say anything you wanted, right, by and large, compared to Britain, which was a much more, shall we say, cosseted sort of view, where the law would protect certain people from things that you could say to them or about them. And they didn't seem to get this at all. And Twitter for a long time have been, shall we say, pursued by legislators in this country to take a harder line on some of the stuff that's published here. And they kind of shook their heads and went, well, why? They didn't actually understand it.
Yeah, so you've actually got this quite a serious problem now, but there's a few headline things that people need to be aware of. The classic indicia for being a publisher is liability for intellectual property breaches, which has already partially or wholly been imposed across a number of jurisdictions, most strenuously in the European Union. The exercise of editorial and quality control, and I'm afraid suspending the President of the United States is the most obvious example. I mean, a news organization like Talk Radio, I mean, obviously he's the president, so this would be difficult for you, but I'll use you because you've been in the news yourself as an entity this week. If you chose not to interview Donald Trump because you thought he would say something inflammatory on your station, that is an exercise of editorial control. You know, Donald Trump, for all that he's the president, doesn't have a right to just appear on Talk Radio. That's in Talk Radio's gift. Now, if Twitter acts in the same way as that, or Facebook or YouTube, then it is acting as a newspaper or a broadcaster would
Yes.
do.
It's taking, in other words, it's taking an editorial view.
It's taking an editorial line. And I'm sorry, I mean, this is the most basic. How do you tell who is a publisher? How do you know who to sue if someone is libeled in a publication or slandered in a broadcast?
Yeah.
It is the most basic indicia of the status of publisher is the exercise of editorial control. This claim is disputed, or the exercise of refusing to platform a particular person, which is entirely legitimate. All these people are saying, "Oh no, he's not."
Right.
You know,
I mean, certainly there have been people, detractors of ours, who you might not be surprised to have said, "What are you getting so worked up about? You know, it's their perfect right to stop you from broadcasting if they so wish. It's a private organisation. You don't have the right to be on YouTube." And to some extent, that's true. But there's not many alternatives.
Well, this is. I mean, this is the point that when I wrote the piece for Standpoint in 2019, the Times was running a campaign, and I think other media organisations were also involved with it, like the Telegraph and the Mirror, saying that you need to treat these outlets as publishers because it's anti-competitive. So whilst and this is where the Conservatives who want more free speech, who they're deluded on the first point, but this is where the Conservatives are not deluded and they do have a sound point. You've got this is something to give them credit, the European Union with their copyright directive did recognise you've got competitive disadvantage for traditional broadcasters or publishers like Talk Radio or The Guardian, and it's anti-competitive. If they're going to behave as publishers, then you need a competitive level playing field, to use the EU language, but it's a good one. It's a standard one from competition law. And if you're or otherwise you literally have set up a two-tiered media environment where the people who are least responsible and least transparent have economic and competitive advantages over the people who are more transparent and more competitive and more careful about their media output. So that's a point where the Conservatives in the US and many people, I have to say, in the European Union as well, do have a serious and valuable point to make.
Yes. And what do you make of this suggestion from places like the Labour Party, who are currently pushing for a kind of I don't know how to best describe it, but some legislation to be brought in basically to make it illegal to say certain things, which which might be, untenable to a lot of people, but why should they be illegal to say?
Well, I mean, I honestly, the Labour Party's in a mess at the moment. I mean, considering how badly the Conservatives have cocked up, excuse me, I'm sorry, the Ofcom button may get pressed there, have fouled up the coronavirus. And I mean, it's not all their fault. I mean, some of it's Public Health England and we won't work on Sundays to roll out the vaccine. And I just saw everybody from left, right and centre yesterday, from the Adam Smith Institute to the Guardian going, "You absolute ridiculous idiots." And I did see an amusing line, do you think the RAF took Sundays off during the Battle of Britain? I don't think so.
No, it didn't work.
I mean,
couldn't do it on Sunday.
Yeah, considering how serious this is really very serious, and you need to get the vaccines out, you need to get Boots involved and all of that kind of thing. So I honestly don't know what's going on with Labour or with the SNP up in Scotland, but because legislation to take specific bits of language out is enormously difficult to draft. It has caused all sorts of problems with these non-crime hate incidents, and people getting arrested or given harassment warnings and so on and so forth for a joke. And the Harry Miller case, the Fair Cop case of the transgender issue is an example of that. That legislation is simply unworkable. And
yes,
because
you cannot frame legislation, in my view, about the words that people use to speak, because either you include certain words and exclude other words. People are cleverer than that. If, for example, somebody said to me, "You can't talk about this," I'll find a way to talk about it, because that's what I do for a living.
Exactly it. And you get everything in code. I mean, there is a case to be made, and I mean, you would need an inquiry first and a green paper and a white paper and all of the things that go with it. there is a case to be made for a serious inquiry here, and also with the European Commission for the EU, because they've now got different laws in this area, into regulating social media as broadcasters and publishers in the traditional way.
Yes.
But you need to understand that would be fine for talk radio. All of your YouTube channel would still be there because you're regulated by Ofcom.
Yeah.
And YouTube, also regulated by, in this hypothetical scenario, also regulated by Ofcom, wouldn't be able to touch you because it would be Ofcom's rules.
Yes.
But all the little YouTube accounts, you know, with only 1,000 subscribers, and where, you know, people are talking about their local scout den or footy club or, you know, or whatever, they would all just disappear. All that user-generated content would disappear as they turned into a broadcaster in the traditional sense, where you go to, you know, the BBC iPlayer or ABC iView in Australia, or so on. Right. That's the thing that we need to confront. We've got this situation where we thought that we could produce this environment where everybody could speak, where all the people could speak to each other in any way they wanted and in any form. And it appears that that social experiment is failing.
Yes, because I think human nature leads it to fail on the basis that, as we used to always say, whenever there was horrible things that happened at football matches and fights would break out with football hooligans, and you'd end up saying, well, I wish football hooligans didn't exist, but unfortunately they do. And it's a fact of life. So, you know, same with free speech. You know, unfortunately, there are some very horrible people who will say some very horrible things, some of which might be dangerous, some of which might just be very, very offensive. But it's, you know, it's not an all or nothing scenario, is it?
Well, this is exactly it. And you've got this purblind problem of people in the United States, which my media law colleagues pointed out about. It's entirely possible they didn't know that Ofcom existed. You've got this problem where there are serious cultural and intellectual problems in the United States generated by enormous conspiracism, and it's both sides of politics. Yeah. I mean, a huge amount of the BLM protests in the United States, which were far, far worse than ours, far worse, led to deaths and enormous destruction. Yeah. And now you've got the right-wing version, for want of a better example, where there's been an assault on the centre of government itself in the Capitol, the legislature. And it's fueled by conspiracy theories. You know, it's fueled by ideas that are completely ridiculous if you think about them for longer than 10 seconds, like defunding the police, or there was so much. And yes, I know the US electoral system, there are problems there. It's, I mean, the Electoral Integrity Project and various people from both right and left have pointed out we've got serious, meaning Americans, have got serious problems with our electoral system. It's corrupt, it doesn't work.
I think it's very old-fashioned as well, isn't it?
It's very old-fashioned, all of that kind of thing. They tried to copy bits from ancient Rome, that, like the Electoral College, that don't seem to work very well in modern democracies. They worked well in an ancient system, that kind of thing. And so you've got other countries, and both BLM and the nutty Trump supporters are you know, two examples of extreme nuttiness on opposite political ends of the spectrum, all of them being imported from the United States. And I mean, I saw a chap who I actually know him slightly because he used to cover Australia, Nick Bryant, for the BBC, and I knew him when I was in Canberra, and he's a very good journalist, and he was just going, my God, this is failed state territory.
Oh, it really is.
So these kinds of riots on both sides. I mean,
well, I mean, the last time I saw anything like what was going on last night in the Capitol building, I think it was in Belarus. You know, when the president was refusing to step aside on the grounds that the people outside were trying to get him out. But listen, Helen, as ever, we've run out of time. I'm terribly sorry. I don't know where the time goes, but we must continue this conversation. I'm sure we will be doing it all year, because I think this might be the big story of the year.